All right, well, right now I am in the city of Boston, which in the 1760s and the early 1770s would have been kind of like the heart of where the American Revolution took place. There are a lot of places here in this city that are iconic to the birth of this country, places like Faneuil Hall and the old State House. And this place right here, this is the Old South Meeting House. And as you can see, it's pretty hectic here today. There are a lot of people out, walking the sidewalks and walking along the street. But it would have been even more hectic in December of 1773 when a group of angry patriots walked out of these doors and started heading down to Boston Harbor to dump some tea in the ocean. So again, what we are looking at right now is the Old South Meeting House. This was where a Puritan congregation would have met. This church was built in 1729 to replace an earlier wooden meeting house. This one was going to be more spacious and was going to be of better building material than wood, obviously made of brick. And there is a lot of history that has occurred within the walls of this space right here. So we're going to dodge inside and take a look at the Old South Meeting House. All right, we just got in here into the Old South Meeting House, and this is a church unlike anything that I've ever seen. Just the configuration of it is something that is honestly new to me. But anyway, we're going to take a look at a few things going on here in the Old South Meeting House, and some of the history that happened right here within these walls. So just imagine it being the 1760s and being a citizen of Boston right here within these walls, listening to any number of speeches or the goings-on in Boston in the 1760s. Now, what we're looking at here is called a wine glass pulpit. This was added later. This building has gone through a number of changes through the years, so a lot of what we're looking at in here is not original. But the box pew thing is, again, so interesting to me. But so we're going to kind of consult an expert and get a little bit better idea of what happened in this building.
Hello, we are at the Old South Meeting House. This was a congregational church, a Puritan church, built in 1729 by the Third Church of Boston. And as you can see from the floor here, we had box pews. The box pews were essentially rented or leased out annually by members of the church. So the closer you sat to the pulpit, the more money that you paid in to seating here in this building. Now, as we come up to the lower gallery, there was some paid seating, but there's also additional seating for Bostonians who couldn't afford to be sitting on the floor here. Up on the upper gallery here is where the poorest Bostonians would sit, additional free seating, but also we had segregated seating in this building in our early years, and this would be for free people of color and enslaved. One of our most famous congregates was Phyllis Wheatley, who was a poetess. And she sat up here in one of these galleries when she was a congregate here up until 1773. But nonetheless, really a congregational church until 1768. Now in 1768, John Hancock's boat, Liberty, was confiscated. due to maritime laws. And James Otis Jr., the most outspoken representative of Boston, the man who coined the phrase "no taxation or representation" in the council chamber in the Old State House in 1761, holds a meeting in here to discuss the infringement on English liberties, what happened to John Hancock's boat. And this is the first time that we really see this space being utilized by the town for what we call meetings of the body. Although Faneuil Hall was built with that in mind in 1742, the Great Hall is what they call it today, really had the capacity of about 1,300. But back in Boston in 1760s, there was tons of people that wanted to voice their opinions and wanted to be present at these meetings, so they largely reconvened here. Started Faneuil Hall, reconvened here. And so we have meetings after the Boston Massacre in 1770 here on March 6th. And then we have the commemorations that happen in this building about the Boston Massacre on the anniversary. And we have John Hancock in 1771, Dr. Joseph Warren in 1772, and others up until 1775. The most famous of these meetings of the body, were the debates that led to the Boston Tea Party.
Now, I'm going to jump ahead in history a little bit here. After the battles of Lexington and Concord, the city of Boston is going to be placed under siege. And the British actually came into the Old South Meeting House, tore out all of the pews, filled this whole space with dirt, and used this room as a writing school. And after the siege, well, George Washington came into the Old South Meeting House here, and if you look up here, they have inscribed, it says, during the occupation of Boston by the British, this meeting house was used by the Queen's Light Dragoons as a writing school. Soon after the evacuation, Washington, looking down from this gallery on the wreck which the British had left, reverently expressed surprise that those who venerated their own churches should have desecrated ours. So yeah, pretty wild to think about this whole building being emptied out, filled with dirt, and used as a writing school. I just mentioned how this place was turned into a British writing school during the Siege of Boston. We'll take a look at this. During the 19th century, there was a renovation that took place here, and they found this horseshoe under the floorboards, which is kind of cool. And then also, look at this. This is a portable writing desk that belonged to John Hancock. What we are looking at here is a copy of the floor plan of the lower floor for the Old South Meeting House. So here's the pulpit right here, and you can see that there are these pews, or these boxes that go right up to the pulpit. So we look at this now, and even though it's a good interpretation, it does look different than what the Old South Meeting House would have looked like in the 1760s. I may have mentioned this, and maybe I didn't, but the interior of the Old South Meeting House looks a lot different than it did in the 1700s. For one thing, all of the pews that you see here were rebuilt and put in here in the 1940s. This area would have been a lot more crowded, but there is the remains of one pew. This is named pew number 20. And if I'm not mistaken, I think it's actually constructed from the remains of a couple of different pews. But this is one of the pews that was put back into the Old South Meeting House after the Siege of Boston. As I mentioned earlier, the British had completely cleared everything out. Of course, during the siege, people needed firewood, so a lot of that stuff was burned. But yeah, this is one of the originals that was put back in after the siege. Here in the Old South Meeting House, they have some different exhibits and things that are interpreting the people who worshipped within these walls and met here, and some of the events that happened here. So, for example, here is a sermon that was given by a guy named Reverend Thomas Prince. It was giving thanks for a British military victory in 1746. And Deidre mentioned Phyllis Wheatley. Okay, so Phyllis Wheatley, as she mentioned, was a poet and was an African American who worshipped within these walls, was the first African American woman to have a published work. A little bit more on her story. She was actually born in West Africa and was captured at the age of 7 and sold as a slave in Boston. And it was the Wheatley family that ended up purchasing her. And under their roof, she learned to read and to write in both Latin and English, which is pretty dang impressive. And at 13, started writing poetry. And here you can see the poems on various subjects, religious and moral, by Phyllis Wheatley. One other thing that I want to point out that they have here in the Old South Meeting House is the symbolic role that this building has played in free speech and dissent in this country. So, free speech is one of the bedrock foundations of the freedoms that we have in this country. And here in the Old South Meeting Church, they take a little bit of space here to reinforce that and to kind of point back to our roots. Now, as we've already mentioned, the Old South Meeting House has deep and direct ties to the famed Boston Tea Party here in Boston. Just as a quick background, the British had put a tax on tea here in the colonies that of course the colonists were deeply dissatisfied with. And to get around this tea tax, well, they were just smuggling in tea. So anyway, in 1773, the British Parliament passed something called the Tea Act that allowed the English East India Company to sell their tea to American colonies at really low prices, but there was still a tax. So the Patriot leaders, kind of thought that this was a ploy to get them to kind of accept the Parliament's right to tax the colonies. Well, when 3 ships from the East India Company arrived in Boston, the Patriots were basically refusing to allow the tea to be unloaded and the tax to be paid. And for about 3 weeks, there were all kinds of meetings that were going on to try and appeal to the local governor, a guy by the name of Hutchison, to send these ships away. And finally, on December 16th of 1773, it got down to where, well, something had to be done. Either the ships had to go or the tea had to be unloaded. And when Hutchison, failed to negotiate with the colonists, the Sons of Liberty stormed down to Griffin's Wharf and dumped 342 chests of tea into the harbor. And this vial right here holds some of that tea. Got a little bit of a glare going on because I don't have the right lens filter with me, but maybe you can kind of make out what Boston looked like during the 1760s. It looks quite a bit different now. For one, this is about 5 square miles, so not nearly as big as the surface area or the footprint that Boston has now. And these are all of the buildings that would have made up the city of Boston. Okay, so here we are right here at the Old South Meeting House. And one of the big changes with Boston is it has more land surface area now than what it did in the 1760s. A lot of this area has been filled in, and right here you can see where the tea ships were coming in, where the tea was dumped into the harbor. Now that area today is pretty much land, but yeah, this is what it would have looked like in the Revolutionary era. So sitting here, you can imagine being one of these colonists in this packed room, and there's been deliberations going on about what to do with this tea tax and with the 3 tea ships that are in the harbor. And at some point during the meeting, somebody suggested that British tea might mix well with seawater. Well, at one point, there's a guy who enters into the hall and announces that Governor Hutchison is not going to go along with what the colonists want to do. And at that point, Samuel Adams stands up and he says, "Gentlemen, this meeting can do nothing further to save the country." And at that point, there's this big, like a war whoop, and everybody exits this space, and they're heading down to the harbor. I'm starting to feel an increase in the moisture here. So we're going to take a look at this before it unloads on us and starts raining. But right here is a plaque that commemorates the site where the Boston Tea Party took place. So if we read this plaque, it says, "Here formerly stood Griffin's Wharf, at which lay moored on December 16th, 1773, 3 British ships," that would have been the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, "with cargoes of tea to defeat King George's trivial but tyrannical tax of 3 pence a pound. About 90 citizens of Boston, partly disguised as Indians, boarded the ships, threw the cargo, 342 chests in all, into the sea, and made the world ring with the patriotic exploit of the Boston Tea Party." And then down here they have an excerpt from a poem. It says, "No ne'er was mingled such a drought in palace, hall, or arbor, as freemen brewed and tyrants quaffed that night in Boston's harbor." So yeah, right out in this area, well, probably more like right where we're standing, is where the famed Boston Tea Party took place. Boston has undergone a lot of changes, as I mentioned earlier, and this whole harbor area looks different. But yeah, it was right here in this general vicinity where one of the big turning points in American history took place. All right, well, that was a little bit on the Old South Meeting House and the Boston Tea Party. Now, Boston wasn't the only place where something like this happened. There were other places along the coast where people started protesting against this tea tax. Thomas Hutchison, the local governor who refused to send the tea back, well, his house ended up being ransacked and burned. And British general by the name of Thomas Gage was brought in to kind of crack down on these unruly colonials, and under his authority, the coercive acts were going to be passed. So things were about to really crack down here in Boston. And what we see here is just the temperature increasing a little bit more and a little bit more until we finally get to the first shots at Lexington and Concord.